Eric Brakey is the executive director of the New Hampshire Free State Project, a former three-term Maine senator, and the past Maine state director of the Ron Paul 2012 campaign. He is known as the author of Maine's constitutional carry law and an advocate for libertarians winning for office within the GOP. So I want to open this by sharing a quote that comes from Jason Sorens, and I want to sort of discuss this quote first. And this comes from his announcement of the Free State Project over 20 years ago. Partisan politics has clearly failed. Libertarian presidential candidates consistently fail to break the 1% to 2% barrier, while no libertarian candidate has ever won an election for federal office. What is the chance that the libertarian presidential candidate will ever get 5% of the vote in the next, say, 20 years? Virtually zero. I bet the farm on that. And what is the chance that libertarians will take over the presidency, the Supreme Court, Congress, and enact their entire program? One would have to be utterly delusional to consider the possibility so long as the U.S. political system exists in its current form. And again, that comes from Jason Sorens nearly 20 years ago. So thank you for being here, man. Yeah, I'd love to, I guess, start with your thoughts on that.
Well, it's been 20 years, and I think that so far he's been proven right. I mean, there have been real flashpoints of opportunity. Certainly the Ron Paul presidential campaigns of 2008 and 2012, I think, were high moments for the libertarian movement. But even there, we weren't able to break through the grip of the Republican establishment on that nominating process. And even if even if Ron Paul had gotten elected president in 2012, when he had the best opportunity to, he would have been still dealing with a completely captured Congress, one captured by special interests and the military-industrial complex. And I think that we spend so much time focusing on what happens in Washington, D.C., and pitting our hopes and dreams on this election cycle. It's going to be different and everything's going to change. And certainly, I'm a little excited by what happened this election cycle. I think there is some opportunity for some change, but I don't have any illusions that, Donald Trump or the Republican Senate or the Republican House is going to come in with a white horse and just rescue us all. Real change happens from the bottom up. And particularly when I think that we've seen in Congress that, speaking as someone who's run for Congress twice, democracy on the federal level has become more of an illusion, right? It's become more of a toy steering wheel you hand to a child in the car to make them think that they're driving, when really the major policy decisions are being made by those who nobody ever voted for, have no accountability towards the electorate, and our Congress spends a lot of their time naming post offices, right? The things that don't actually matter. Now, maybe we've finally reached a boiling point where, with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy leading the Department of Government Efficiency, maybe with Tulsi Gabbard going into as the Director of National Intelligence, Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. I mean, these are all figures who I think are, to some degree, seem genuinely interested in a disruption of the status quo. Maybe there's some reason for optimism. But if we are not doing the work that we need to do to shore things up in our own communities back home, I think we're ultimately missing the real opportunity. And of course, the Free State Project is based on that idea. I think, as you read, that libertarians, and I use that word in a very big tent general sense. Anyone who loves liberty loves, I think, the principles outlined in our founding documents, particularly the Declaration of Independence. These are the ideas that our country was founded on, but they are ideas that have become increasingly scarce in the general electorate over the course of the last several centuries. And so libertarians maybe account for 3 to 5% of the electorate in any given community around the country. And, if you were to count everyone up around the country, there are millions of us, But scattered as we are in California and Texas and, wherever you may find yourself, there are not enough of us in this diaspora to have a real impact on affecting the politics and the culture around us. So the Free State Project was this idea of, what if you gathered up the diaspora? What if you invited libertarians from all across the country, and in some cases the world, to concentrate in one place? And what happens then when we aren't a minority, but we are concentrated? And so that is the kernel of the idea of the Free State Project. And over the last 20 years, New Hampshire was picked as the state for a number of reasons. It's a small population state, 1.3 million people. So, let's say 20,000 people moved to New Hampshire. That has a big impact versus everyone moved to Texas or California. You're a drop in the ocean. But of course, New Hampshire was also already a fairly libertarian state. And, the state motto is live free or die. There's been a strong ethic, a libertarian ethic there ever since the American Revolution and leading up to that has never fully died, even as New England itself has, I think, lost touch with that spirit of 1776. It's still alive in New Hampshire. So over the course of the last 20 years, people have moved. Estimates range from, 7 to 10,000 people have moved over the last 20 years, averaging, really, if you average it out, it's almost like one a day. And this has resulted in not just political victories. Those are the easiest things to measure, right? We can see that free staters and libertarians account for almost a quarter now of all the elected seats in the state legislatures, that the New Hampshire Senate and the New Hampshire House. I think I can say pretty definitively that makes them the most libertarian political bodies in the world.
Maybe outside of Liberland.
Yeah,
I've been there. I've been to Liberland.
All right, I haven't been to Liberland yet. I guess maybe we'll have to see how we can if we can find some objective metrics there.
Right.
And we've gotten many kind of political victories out of that. School choice. There's no income tax, no sales tax. Constitutional carry, even defend the guard, which you and I were talking about before we started recording. I'm sure we'll talk about more. But even more than that, beyond the political victories, and this is a harder thing to measure, this is something that more has to be experienced when you come to New Hampshire, is that there are strong libertarian communities around the state in a way that you don't see anywhere else in the country. I mean, libertarian community in the country, you think about like people on Twitter, right?
Right.
When we're scattered, you don't really get to form real in-person community. But in New Hampshire, there are libertarian hiking groups, libertarian theater groups, libertarian basketball groups, libertarian, and there are also people who sit around and talk about cryptocurrency and political issues, right? But it's not just that. It's being able to be in community with people who you share common core values with. But you don't need to just sit around obsessing about politics. I mean, once you've kind of got the political challenges taken care of, there's so much more to life than politics.
Amen. Well said. So I want to start with sort of defining terms just a little bit for the audience, because a lot of these terms get thrown around and without proper definitions of terms for this conversation, I feel like it might be a little bit confusing to those that are listening and watching. So you already gave a loose definition of libertarianism, but especially being someone who I think at this point understandably wants to sort of infiltrate the GOP with liberty-centric ideas. And as I was sharing before we recorded, I've always had this thought that most conservatives, even a lot of my family members who are, call themselves conservatives or, just lean red, if you will, are actually libertarians. They just don't realize it, especially like in a lot of the ways that they think, especially as it comes to like interpersonal dynamics between people that they fundamentally disagree with on things, very libertarian in their viewpoint. But what is the difference? And you don't have to give like an official definition here, but just as best you can, between libertarianism and conservatism.
Well, first of all, I would say that the core principle, the core axiom of libertarianism is the non-aggression principle, which is, as Matt Kibbe, I think, very eloquently just boiled it down, don't hurt people and don't take their stuff. And don't think that because we dress up government actions in magic words like taxation and war, that distinguishes it from theft and mass murder, right? If I can't hurt people and I can't take their stuff, then what right do I have to appoint an agent of the state to do it for me? If I can't lock my neighbor up in my basement because he's smoking cannabis and I don't like it, then why do I have the right to appoint an agent to take him and put him in a cage, right? Your agent can't have any more authority than the person who appointed them their agent. So as far as kind of distinguishing between libertarianism and conservatism, I tend to find that conservatism is a word that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Right. And so when someone says that they're a conservative, I say, okay, what is it that you want to conserve? Let's be specific here. Because you can be a religious conservative, you want to conserve kind of biblical
Christian values,
things like that, and there's place for that. I know many libertarians who are religious conservatives, as long as they recognize that we don't use the state to impose our religious values on people beyond protecting life, liberty, and property. You can be a neoconservative, which is, in my mind, not very conservative.
Not at all.
A neoconservative is, I think, much more interested in conserving the post-World War II global empire that we currently live under.
Using the U.S. military largely as a tool for both the United Nations and also a tool for bankers under the guise of fighting for freedom and preserving what's here.
Yeah. Right. But I would say that the real American conservative tradition, I think, is a lot of, identify a lot with what we saw during the Tea Party years, right? A conservatism that harkens back to our founding documents and our founding principles, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence in particular, because of course the Declaration of Independence was really the philosophical document, that gave the mission statement of America. And if you are a conservative in that sense, if you are a conservative who wants to conserve the Constitution, the principles of the Constitution, limited government, federalism, if you want to conserve the principles of the Declaration of Independence, I would say you are a kind of libertarian. Whether you know it or not, because those are libertarian documents. They espouse libertarian principles. I mean, in the days of our founders, we might have called them classical liberals. Today, we call it libertarianism. And I think sometimes people get confused with this word too, when they hear like someone is a conservative in the context of some other country, right? I mean, a conservative in the United Kingdom is very different than a conservative in the American tradition, right? A conservative in the United Kingdom, I mean, their traditions are monarchical,
right?
Or a conservative in Iraq, is conserving a very different kind of governmental tradition than we have. So, what we call conservative really depends on. You really need to ask, okay, we're conserving a tradition. What is that tradition?
Right. Yeah, I really appreciate that definition, especially the line, the sort of demarcation, and I think really bifurcation that is continuing to split, really highlighting the difference between neoconservatism, that is very apparent, these sort of war hawk, like warmongering people, versus what I would call libertarians that don't know they're libertarians that say they're conservatives, essentially. That I think those are the two large groups that I see, and I know that there's nuances between the two. So the other definition that I want to establish before we continue on is in your mind the difference between voluntarism / agorism and libertarianism, if there is one. Because a lot of people will say they're one and the same, and libertarians are simply voluntarists that want to use the mechanism of government, not use, but want to infiltrate the government to dismantle it and make it so we're living in a truly voluntarist society. And then others will say, well, no, like libertarianism, there's still a place for police, for example, by the state, but the police, their only job is to ensure men and women are not committing acts of aggression against each other and abiding by the non-aggression principle. So
yeah. I mean, I suppose I think of libertarianism as a broad term that is inclusive of many of these things. And so, right, as you mentioned, there are libertarians who are more, call them minarchists, right? People who believe in a minimal state, but still they believe that there needs to be a state with a monopoly on violence. Might call a night watchman state. I think many of the more maybe voluntarist or anarcho-capitalist members of the libertarian movement would suggest that, you know, it's nice that you start with that minimal state, but we look at the trajectory of what state power does, and it never stays that way, right?
That's what the anti-federalists were talking about.
Yeah. Boy, you read back some of the arguments at the ratifying conventions from, I think it was Patrick Henry.
Yeah.
And I remember reading a biography on James Madison, kind of going into it. And of course, like I'm thinking like, as I'm reading this, I'm thinking like I'm rooting for the proponents of the Constitution because I love the Constitution, at least compared to where we are now. But you read the warnings of Patrick Henry and it reads like prophecy. Everything he said would happen if we ratified the Constitution came to pass. Actually, today that we record this is the anniversary of the adoption of the Articles of Confederation.
Wow.
So anyway, some libertarians would argue maybe the Articles were better despite what we learned in U.S. history class. So I don't know whether you're a voluntarist, an agorist, I'm very interested in politics. I am, in the last 12 years of my life, I've been focused on using the machinery of politics to try to advance libertarian objectives. But I'm not someone who thinks that that's the only way.
Right.
I think that, look, if I always go back to, I think this was one of the most important moments in the recent history of the libertarian movement, was at the end of Ron Paul's 2012 presidential campaign. He retired from Congress and, he had sparked this huge revolution, this huge grassroots movement. And it was bigger than him, right? He was the figurehead. He's like the godfather of this movement, but ultimately like, unlike maybe some other movements, like the MAGA movement, for example, like Ron Paul was always a very humble man. I always thought it was amazing. You look at his book, that like the Revolution and Manifesto, and you can look at the cover of that book versus the cover of every other book of every other person running for president. And on the cover of every other presidential candidate's book is their face, right? On the cover of Ron Paul's book is the Constitution, right? You've got to turn to the back to see, Ron, like he was about the ideas. And I think that's why his movement has staying power, where Mitt Romney is going to be a footnote in history. But at the end of his campaign, people went to him and they said over and over, like, what do I do now? Like, we want to continue fighting for liberty. We want to continue pursuing this. Like, tell me what to do. But Ron is not a central planner, and he doesn't want to be a central planner. And that's one of the great things about him. So he just told people, like, I don't know. You got to figure it out for yourself. There's a job out there for you, but you have to find it. Now, for me, I took that and said, all right, I'm going to run for the state Senate, and I'm going to try to advance libertarianism politically, which I've been doing for the last 12 years. But other people, they heard Ron Paul's message of, challenging the Federal Reserve. And a lot of people who are pursuing the political path could only see the way to do that was like, we need to try to audit the Fed, and we need to try to end the Fed, right? And we're going to get Congress to do that one day. And that still hasn't happened. But other people went out, and rather than doing politics, they just engineered a parallel system of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, and they created a competing institution of the Federal Reserve that now I'm glad there are people on the political path who are on that road who can help protect this system from government attacks. Like, we need both. But then there are other people who went out and they said, we're going to raise the next generation of independent, liberty-loving kids. And they built homeschooling networks. And then there are people who, so there are so many different paths to advance liberty. And I think that that's the strength of our movement, is that there isn't a one path to try to stop us at. There isn't one figurehead that the CIA could take out and it will be over. Like, we are attacking, the system from all directions because we are a bottom-up movement without a central plan, and people are pursuing liberty in the way that they believe they will be the most effective. And I think that's why our victory is inevitable.
I love that so much. I was over here just smiling and nodding at everything that he was saying. So I was listening to a debate. I don't remember who it was between, but it was between a woman who was a representative of the Libertarian Party and then a guy who was part of the Free State Project. I don't think he's a part of the Free State Project anymore. He just recently left. But nonetheless, a debate between the two of them on whether the best approach to preserve and ensure and advance libertarian ideas, liberty-centric ideas, was a project like the Free State Project, where you're aggregating all of the liberty-centric people, or many of them, in one area, or trying to subvert and infiltrate the federal government in order to push liberty-centric ideas there. And after listening to the two of them debate, I'm like, maybe this was a topic that they just wanted to debate on for whatever reason, but why does it have to be an either-or approach? Why can't it be a both? And likewise, I will say this. I'm a voluntarist through and through, and like I'm fully in agreement with what the anti-federalists were talking about, with even to some degree, if libertarianism is able to infiltrate the federal government to some degree, how do we know that that isn't going to be reversed at some point? Or how do we know that that mechanism of government isn't going to evolve to then be wielded in terms of its power and so-called authority to do the very same evil acts and the tyrannical acts that it has been doing for, the past few centuries? So I have come to a softer position. I won't say softer. I'm still very principled, but you heard in the conversation between Derek Brose and I that I had in episode 128 that I am not going to sit here and say that there is not a place for doing that, for infiltrating the federal government. With that being said, I think that if we're focusing all of our attention on that, or becoming so emotionally and financially and forming entire ideologies around that, I think that's a losing battle. I think it has to, or the majority of our focus has to be at the state and, lower levels than the state. It has to be at that level. And really, in the majority, I think that the focus needs to be on cultivating liberty at the individual level and bringing together masses of people who have adopted those principles. And so the question I want to pose to you, because I actually don't know the answer to this, is using the tyranny from 2020 through 2023, 2024 as an example, what was it like in New Hampshire, given that there were so many people, irrespective of the political happenings, right, federally and on the state level? What was it like in New Hampshire during that era?
Yeah, so first I'll say I wasn't there, so I only have stories. I was actually here in Texas at the time working for Young Americans for Liberty, hearing terror stories from back home in Maine, where many of my friends and family were. And I will say that in Maine, probably stories were much like many stories around the country. Those who were not bought in to the propaganda and the mandates and the tyranny felt isolated and alone, right? It's one thing when there's a mandate from some government official saying you have to stay in your home, you're not allowed to go to work, you're not allowed to see your loved ones, you're not allowed to celebrate Thanksgiving, whatever it might be. It's another thing when your neighbors are snitching on you to the government when you don't follow those orders. Right. And I know so many folks in Maine who felt isolated and alone because, your friends and loved ones were living in the matrix and were buying all of this, and but in New Hampshire, because of the concentration of libertarians, people weren't alone. Now, I will say that the state government, the governor of New Hampshire was participating in a lot of the mandates, and maybe it wasn't as bad as some other governors in New England, but he was still participating in that. He was certainly no Ron DeSantis on all of this. But because of the strong free state communities, because of these networks that, you're in community and with people who share these values and view the government in a similar light, life got to go on fairly normally for people. And I know that one of the great moments in New Hampshire was, we have every single year the Porcupine Freedom Festival in New Hampshire.
Porkfest, right?
Yeah, Porkfest for short. Some people call it the Libertarian Burning Man. It's a week-long camping festival under the White Mountains. By the way, we're having it again in June this year, this next year. Certainly hope you will come out and join us if you've never been, even if you have
never been.
All right.
I'd love to.
Well, you're invited.
Awesome.
Right. Pork Fest went on, right? We didn't let that stop us. And people were so relieved from all around the country to be able to come out and gather, both in 2020 and in 2021 when these lockdowns were still going on. And so many other events were canceled out of fear.
In nearly all cases with modern health systems, you're waiting months for appointments only to spend a mere 10 minutes with a doctor who quickly hands out a generic diagnosis that is likely rooted in a total misunderstanding of health and causes, and then you're offered a one-size-fits-all medication or invasive treatments with unpleasant side effects. If this sounds all too familiar, consider a different approach with the New Biology Clinic, founded by Dr. Tom Cowan, a respected natural health doctor, author, and speaker. Dr. Cowan's holistic perspective on health and wellness and a deep understanding of the true nature of health and disease sets this clinic apart. With the New Biology Clinic, it's not about quick fixes and suppressing symptoms. The practitioners take time to understand your unique story, recognizing that health is unique to the individual and that illnesses have a variety of causes, physically and metaphysically. Members of the New Biology Clinic enjoy a flat monthly fee that includes a range of valuable services like health consults as needed, practitioner-led live streams on diverse health topics, access to a members-only resource library, and multiple live group sessions every month. These sessions cover fitness, breathing integration, biofield tuning, guided meditation, EFT tapping, and much more. Unlike traditional healthcare systems that thrive on frequent visits, prescriptions, treatments, and suppressing symptoms, the New Biology Clinic's motivation is to make you healthy and keep you that way. Visit newbiologyclinic.com to learn more and use code THEWAYFORWARD for $50 off your account activation. If you're a member of The Way Forward, email hello@thewayforward.com to receive $150 off your account activation. Your journey to genuine healing begins here. Yeah, it's incredible. And see, that's the point that I was getting at. I was kind of leading you to say what I thought you would end up saying there, is that if you gather together people who have these shared values regarding liberty, and especially at this point in time, let's say reverse back 10 days ago at the time of recording this, and let's say Kamala Harris won that election, right? And we can speculate all day on the legitimacy of everything at the federal level, but the point being, the overwhelming majority of the so-called freedom community, in my mind, would have been demoralized had that happened, right? Forgetting that government supposedly derives its authority from the consent of the governed, and ultimately our actions on a daily basis, or inactions, are driven by our fundamental thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and spoken words. So I look at a place like New Hampshire with how many libertarian people, freedom-loving people are there concentrated in one place, that if Kamala Harris would have won, I'm sure there would have been a lot like, bummer, because that would have been an opportunity to infiltrate the government. But you know what? All of us have these shared values. And as we saw during COVID in New Hampshire amongst all of us, it doesn't really matter what happens at that level, because we know that we have the power to create parallel systems. And we know that our authority is not granted to us by government. And we know that there are so many of us concentrated in one area that what the heck are they going to do to us, given that we don't recognize them as a legitimate authority? And like that mindset shift, just the mindset shift that then leads to different actions and inactions at an individual and a collective level is incredible. And I don't think that we're really grasping the power of that in the freedom movement at large.
Yeah. Well, and I think that individuals who don't grasp that need to come and visit New Hampshire and experience what it is like to actually be in a consistent community. It's one thing to like go off to a festival or a convention and like be with people for like a week. It's another thing when this is day-to-day life, is that you're surrounded by people who share your values. And when the government like does something ridiculous, like everything we experienced during COVID, that you have a whole community that has your back to just say, we're ignoring this, we're going about our lives as normal, and your mandates, your pieces of paper that you shuffle around in state houses or in. I mean, I guess in this case, it wasn't. The state houses were shut down, so it wasn't even that, right?
Yeah.
But it's like this is of no consequence to us. What is of consequences? Do we follow our own basic tenets, like don't hurt people, don't take their stuff? If we do that, we can have a pretty good life, and we can build things that enable us to opt out of these systems. And I do want to respond to one thing you were saying earlier. Right? I don't think it is a mutually exclusive choice between,
Right.
Concentrating in New Hampshire and focusing locally and building our systems there, and infiltrating the federal apparatus, if we want to call it that. That's certainly not our focus in the Free State movement, but I do think that inevitably a consequence of this concentration strategy is one day. I mean, we've got 98 libertarian elected legislators in New Hampshire. We've got a really deep bench of awesome people who are learning how to use the political process to advance liberty. I think that over, we're 20 years into this. We were like one of the biggest, most powerful ideological factions in the state legislature. That hasn't trickled up yet to federal representation from New Hampshire, right? We've got Democrat U.S. senators. We've got Democrat representatives in the House, the U.S. House. Not that it matters so much to me if they're Republican or Democrat. I mean, if they were neoconservative Republicans, I would complain just as much, or almost as much. I don't know. It depends on depends on how bad they were. But I do think that as time goes on, it is inevitable that you will start to see Liberty U.S. senators coming out of New Hampshire and Liberty congressmen coming out of New Hampshire. And I think that would be good if for no other reason than as we're trying to make sure people know that New Hampshire is the free state. This is the libertarian homeland, right? If nothing else, a U.S. senator serves as a good mascot.
Well, that's the point, is at least to raise awareness. Like what we see right now with RFK, Trump saying that he's going to nominate him as the head of HHS. Even if that doesn't come to fruition, just talking about it, just bringing those ideas up now creates a ripple effect where there's discussions about raw milk openly. There's discussions about vaccines openly. There's discussions about all these things openly in the mainstream where they weren't on the table before. So at the very least, having that happen would be incredible.
Yeah. And of course, when you think what's the most socialist state in America, people tend to think of Vermont. Why? Because Bernie Sanders is the senator from Vermont. And it's also worth noting that Vermont was not always the most socialist state in America. It used to be the most conservative state in America.
It's your neighbor too. That's
it's our neighbor. But there was decades ago, I don't think they called it this, but it was kind of like a socialist state project. There was an intentional migration of socialists into Vermont with the purpose of taking over the state. And I mean, that's the wave that led Bernie Sanders from New York to Vermont. He came in on that. And he became kind of a big figurehead for that political kind of revolution in Vermont. So we're kind of doing that in reverse in New Hampshire. But I will say too, the danger, of course, is let's say we do finally capture Washington, D.C. We infiltrate so well. The challenge always is it's the decision about what you do with the Ring of Power, right?
Right.
Do you take it to Gondor or do you throw it in Mount Doom? And the temptation always is, once you've finally captured it, that, well, it was so bad when other people used this ring, all the evil they did with it, but we can use it now. We need to take it to Gondor to fight the evil people. When really the opportunity must be to dismantle those power structures, dismantle centralized power, restore power back to the states and the people. That's the only way to fix this, because as you're right, the ring always falls to another.
Right.
You may think that we've got this and we will have it forever, but the pendulum always swings, and all this machinery of power that you build up, you have to ask yourself, what will you do when one day this falls into the hands of your enemies? Because it always will.
Yeah, amen. That is so well said, and it's interesting that you brought that up, because just this morning, because everyone is very understandably excited about RFK likely heading HHS. That's an incredible deal. And I invited people to sort of look at it differently, not to not be excited about it, but just to look at this a little bit differently. If RFK, as head of HHS, is able to fundamentally dismantle aspects of the CDC, of the FDA, of NIH, and other corrupt three-letter agencies under that umbrella, incredible. But if it's simply an act of replacement, that another president could come along with his whole team and just reverse that decision, that I think it's misplaced hope, in my opinion, and it's missing the point. All of these entities are unconstitutional, and I don't even like talking about it in terms of constitution, not constitution. They're utterly tyrannical. They have no place in a liberty-oriented society, right? Which is what we were originally supposed to be founded upon. And given that, they need to be dismantled at its core. And that goes back to exactly what you're saying with the ring of power. Yes, I'm excited that RFK is being given this opportunity, and I hope that he will get the ring and all the people on the MAGA team get that ring and crush it. But based on Trump's actions and inactions in his first term, I'm a little bit skeptical of that. I would say I'm highly skeptical of that.
I think it's reasonable to be skeptical. I think that we should be skeptical of anyone who's given power.
Right.
I think with RFK, and first of all, I want to say I remember the first time I met Bobby Kennedy. He came I was the Senate chairman of the Health and Human Services Committee in Maine during my first 2 terms, and we had a bill to eliminate the religious and philosophical exemptions for vaccines. And I appreciated that he came to testify against that, and I think he made a compelling case. Thankfully, we defeated at that point in time. But when I left the state Senate and a Democrat replaced me, he became the deciding vote to eliminate religious and philosophical exemptions. So that was Maine's been on a bad trajectory ever since. But a lot of good people have moved away because they felt that their families weren't safe.
Did you have any involvement with Maine Stand Up by chance, Dr. Chris Northrup?
We ran in similar circles, but I wasn't directly involved. Of course, because when I had run for Congress in 2020. I was the front runner for the Republican nomination, and then COVID happened, and they moved the election date. We had to pull back our door knockers, and then Kevin McCarthy came in and spent $500,000 against me, calling me a never Trumper, which was ironic because, I have made critical statements of Donald Trump, particularly when I was serving as the state chair for Rand Paul's presidential campaign in 2016. I knew that the reason so much money was being spent against me was because I was more in alignment with his stated foreign policy than they were. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of the irony of neoconservatives attacking me as a never Trumper because they were afraid I would support Trump's stated foreign policy of untangling and ending some of the wars. Anyway, but Maine Stands Up, I obviously got really started during COVID and built up through that. But after I lost my primary, I took a step back and came down here to Texas and worked with Young Americans for Liberty for a year and a half. So I was kind of out of the picture a little bit in Maine while they were really in full swing. But I respect a lot of the work that they were doing. But back to Kennedy, which we were talking about, I guess is what Donald Trump calls the weave, right? But back to Kennedy, it'll be interesting to see if he does get confirmed. Boy, the confirmation hearings are going to be wild unless they do recess appointments like the Trump administration is hoping for. There's a lot that Kennedy could do that would, I think, be very positive, right? If he, if the FDA became, and it gave advisories rather than like prohibitions, right? If the FDA says, this has not been FDA approved, you can make your own decision what you do with it. But we are telling you this has not been FDA approved, and you take that into advisement as you decide kind of like what health decisions you're going to make. I don't have any problem with that if they're not using force. I mean, maybe you can argue, should our tax dollars be going to that in the first place? But as long as they're not like prohibiting us from accessing, cannabis or other kind of natural things.
Nor forcing us to take other things.
But if so, that's kind of one example of ways that you could dismantle the power structure there. But if all Kennedy does is substitute his kind of ideology for theirs, but within the same centralized system, I think that would be a mistake. You know, one thing I really appreciated watching him on the campaign trail that he seems to articulate an understanding of very well is the corporate capture of these institutions. What I'm not totally confident in and is, does he understand that corporate capture is inevitable as long as you have these centralized institutions, right? So as long as we concentrate power in one place, it becomes a one-stop shop for special interests. That's why the wisdom of the founding generation, it was so excellent in the understanding that power must be decentralized. These decisions must be made in the states and the localities and by individual people for themselves as much as possible. So we'll see what happens there. I personally hope, I haven't seen too much conversation on this, but I campaigned for Congress I called it my plan to personalize healthcare. And I was really kind of looking at just how I guess I tend to look at, I don't consider myself a health expert. I don't want to give people health advice. Talk to your doctor, don't talk to me. Hopefully it's a direct primary care doctor who's actually working for you and not the insurance companies and all of that. But I look at things through more, I guess, the lens of economics. And what I see is a system that has some of the worst incentives that you could possibly imagine, right? In our healthcare system, who is the customer, right? Every economic actor, every business serves their customers. Why do they do it? Because that's how you survive, right? You have to make sure your customer is happy. The customer is always right. Or as I like to talk about the golden rule. We all know the golden rule from the Bible. That's an important one. But I also like the golden rule from the movie Aladdin. I don't know if you remember this.
What's this one?
Jafar in disguise, it tells Aladdin, the golden rule, he who has the gold makes the rules, right? And so you look at our healthcare system right now and how much of the economic transactions are being controlled by third-party payers, whether it's big insurance companies or big government bureaucracies. We have a system run by bureaucracies for bureaucracies, right? A third of the price of healthcare is the price of bureaucracy. And what are we paying for? We're putting all this money into a system for the privilege of being bossed around. So, my proposal was, how do we re-inject kind of real kind of, how do we put the consumer back in the driver's seat? Mm-hmm. How do we make the system reorient towards the person who's actually receiving the care? Milton Friedman talks about the worst kind of economic decisions are those that are made by someone who has no stake in the quality of the outcome or the price of what goes into it. And that's kind of where we are with these third-party payers. They don't care if you get good health care. No. They don't care how much it costs. They're not paying for it, and their life is not on the line. But if we took, let's say we took Medicaid, one of the biggest payers for healthcare, and rather than kind of going in the direction that folks like AOC and Bernie Sanders want to go to of a single-payer healthcare system, what if we just tried to get back to what if we went in the opposite direction and we had millions and millions of payers? We made the customers the payers. Now, the consumers the payers. Now, of course, maybe we accept the premise that some folks won't be able to afford and we need to subsidize people's healthcare in some way, shape, or form. But let's do it smartly.
You can do that privately, though, too.
You can do it privately, yeah. You can do it through...
That's what I always think of when it comes to anything that's subsidized that is ultimately funded by taxpayers. And then there's even arguments on where our tax dollars actually go. But assuming they go to what we think they go towards, I think that it is fundamentally immoral, and all things that are tax funded supposedly could be done in the private and could be done better in the private because there would be an incentive to perform well because there could also be competition in that arena too.
Yeah. Well, certainly taxation is theft, and I would abolish it if tomorrow if I could.
Exactly. But I figured if you're the director of the Free State Project, you got to be on the same page, and I figured so.
But short of that, if taxpayer money is going into this system, rather than giving it to a bureaucracy to hand out to another bureaucracy, what if we just put those dollars directly into health savings accounts that the individual is in control of, so they can have direct relations with their healthcare providers? And that would be transformative, because right now, even if you are someone who's trying to private pay for healthcare, the system is not designed for you.
No,
The
absolutely
system
not.
is designed for a third-party payment model, and you are such a small fraction of the overall customer base that
Right.
you don't matter to them.
Right. Yeah, and of course, the government both suppresses more natural approaches to health,
Yeah.
and also insurance companies don't want to touch anything that is truly a natural approach to health either.
Yeah.
That's the other thing too. So, there's so many things with respect to health that totally need to be reformed, even like foundational premises that still a lot of people who want to reform health for a more like libertarian oriented way of being with respect to health are largely coming from flawed premises on the true causes of illness and how to approach causes of illness. But luckily, again, with people like RFK being in these positions, or at least signaling that they will be in these positions, it is bringing some of these conversations, not all, but some of these central conversations to the forefront, which is absolutely incredible.
And if the only thing he got done was like restoring liability to pharmaceutical companies, like every other product that exists in the marketplace, that would be a big thing.
Incredible. It'd be absolutely incredible. It would lead to the total destruction of the vaccine industry, in my opinion, but which is, in my opinion, a good thing.
Or
But
at least a reimagining.
Reimagining at the least.
Yeah.
I would call for total destruction, but that's just me. But anyway, I want to get back to focusing on the Free State Project itself. What are some of the criticisms that you find from, let's say, liberty-oriented people with respect to the Free State Project? Because, of course, like leftist people or even neocons, they're going to give criticisms, but that's largely not my audience, so I'm not really concerned with that. But what are the criticisms that you find from liberty-centric people with respect to the Free State Project?
It's usually the loudest complaints that I hear are basically, oh, we don't want to be near those libertarians. Right? Because there are many different kinds of libertarians, right? Ultimately what we believe is a negative philosophy, don't hurt people, don't take their stuff, is an incomplete philosophy, or at least that's how I view it. Your philosophy for life is going to be much bigger than just libertarianism, right? I'm informed by Taoism and the life of Jesus Christ, and many different things inform my overall kind of worldview and philosophy. Some people are much more religiously conservative. Some people are much more libertine. I like to think that if we all kind of have these shared kind of basis and, just don't hurt people, don't take their stuff, we can all live together. But you don't have to associate with people you don't want to. So sometimes I hear from people in other parts of the country who aren't there in New Hampshire, don't understand that there's a wide ecosystem of libertarians with many different views on things. They'll hear someone espouse a viewpoint that they don't like. Maybe they're much more conservative or much more religious, and they're like, those aren't real libertarians. I don't want to be there. That's the kind of libertarians they have in New Hampshire. Well, the thing is, we have all kinds of libertarians in New Hampshire. And if you come, you will find your community. And maybe it's not, that particular tribe of libertarians, but there are so many different libertarian communities in New Hampshire. You'll find your place. As far as like the overall strategy, though, I truth be told, I don't hear too many critiques, because I think it's undeniable at this point, 20 years in, that the strategy is working.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, where else do you have libertarians controlling 25% of the legislature, right? Nowhere.
Right.
Nowhere. It doesn't exist, at least not in this country, maybe Liberland.
Libertarian, by the way, not to go off on a tangent, I love the way that they approach taxation.
Mm-hmm.
There's, from my understanding, this is what I gathered, is that it's fully voluntary, but there's an incentive to, one, if you do pay tax, you get to choose where your money goes, and you get to see where it goes, directly what it is funded towards. And then you also get an ownership stake in the country itself, which is like, that's brilliant, like a brilliant idea. So if there is to be taxation, I would propose that. But anyway, sorry.
At that point, it stops being taxation.
It's not taxation.
It's voluntary.
Anymore.
It's making contributions and getting a benefit for it, right?
Right. Exactly.
And if you don't want to contribute, that's fine. You don't get the benefits, right?
Exactly.
Anyway. so yeah. Anyway, I hope that folks at Liberland and many of the other kind of experiments in emerging free societies around the world, we are in fact hosting this April our annual New Hampshire Liberty Forum. And this is we're asking people to come and present on the challenges that emerge when you are kind of have an emerging free society, and potential solutions for overcoming those challenges. So I think that we can learn a lot from these experiments in building free societies around the world. I think that New Hampshire is the most successful experiment, but there's a lot we can all learn from each other. And by the way, I did mention PorcFest. Everyone's welcome to join us for that. But if you're more academically focused and you're more interested in just kind of the realm of ideas, we say that the Porcupine Freedom Festival is an opportunity to experience what a free society is like for a week. But the New Hampshire Liberty Forum in April is more of an academically focused event, and we love people to come out and join us.
Awesome. That's incredible. So you bring up some of the challenges in emerging free societies, and a lot of the things that I hear as what I consider to be valid criticisms of, like, how do you orient societal structure? How do you account for like natural hierarchy, if you will, versus the state? How do you order society? How do you still have leadership involvement? How do you manage disputes between people? How do you manage and deal with someone who is committing a crime? As the director of the Free State Project, I know that you're not directly involved with the political happenings necessarily, but I'm sure you've thought about these ideas being in your position. So what would you say is the general, and I'm sure that it varies largely, but the general sentiments on some of these challenges amongst people in New Hampshire? And I'm sure you guys are having a lot of talks on things like this as well and discussions, but yeah, just kind of throwing that at you, your thoughts on all that.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly, I suppose depending on the day, personally, I oscillate between, I guess, being an anarcho-capitalist and a minarchist. I guess it depends on when you catch me. Certainly during my time in the Maine Senate, I've voted for kind of enforcement of laws when those are crimes against life, liberty, or property. So I figure if we have a state, it's fair for us to have, have punishment for crimes where people's rights are actually violated,
right?
Not victimless crimes,
right?
Not where the crime is, not where the victim is society,
right? Or the government.
Yes, particularly not the government, right?
That's always hilarious when I see that someone tries to make an argument. Well, the victim in that case was the government. You defrauded the government, or you didn't give money to the government. I'm like, that is insane. Yeah. There's no actual person that is a victim there.
It's like saying, yeah, you defrauded the mafia. How dare you?
It's insane. Literally insane.
Yeah. It's when someone is accused of tax fraud and failing to pay their taxes, it's like, okay, someone tried to avoid the highway robber. Shame on them.
Right.
They didn't want their money going to bomb brown people in foreign countries for no reason other than to pad the pockets of military industrial complex companies. But yeah, I mean, so as from a minarchist perspective, there's a role for the state there. If you were to go full anarcho-capitalist, I certainly, I don't know that I could articulate incredibly well the ideas because it's been so long since I read the book, but Murray Rothbard wrote a great book. Actually, I got it at my first PorcFest in 2012, 12 years ago. It was called For a New Liberty, in which he really kind of engages in the thought experiment of how do you handle certain functions that we say that only the state can handle, right? How do you handle, defense against foreign adversaries? How do you handle crime and punishment? So that's a great resource to look at. I think oftentimes he kind of comes back to, voluntary insurance companies can in fact provide a lot of the services that we think government provides because they're in the business of managing risk.
Right. Like even to the degree that even outside of insurance, but more assuring protection, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that a good friend of mine proposed in his book, and I know other people along this school of thought have thought about this, but my friend Mark Gober in his book, An End to Upside Down Liberty, he talks about how, for example, policing could be done fully in the private, where local police stations and police officers overwhelmingly don't have an incentive to perform well. And that's not to say that they're not well-intentioned people. I'm not saying that there are not well-intentioned people who are police officers, but they don't have an incentive to perform well because there's no competition. And overwhelmingly, they end up being a lot of the times corrupt to some degree, right? There's a spectrum there, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if you were to put those functions of a police officer into the private, then any man or woman would not be extorted through taxation to have to pay for that service that they don't actually want. Maybe you have an arsenal of guns, or maybe you live in a safe area and you're like, you know what? I don't really feel the need for any protection to that degree. Yeah. I'm just going to rely on my neighbors if I need to, if something bad happens.
Or maybe you pay for a more minimal protection plan,
Right. Yeah. From a private, based security agency, if you will. And you get together with your group of friends in your area and you're like, hey, we want to pay for this service. Would you come patrol our neighborhood once a week?
And certainly in that scenario, if there's competition, certainly the private security company that's busting down people's doors and shooting people willy-nilly, I don't think people are going to hire that company, right?
Exactly.
It's your reputation, in a system like that matters a great deal. And so the market forces can really offer a check on some of the worst things that people often complain about with our current kind of police systems. Even the fight against civil asset forfeiture, it's there've been years in this country in recent years where, through civil asset forfeiture, basically police officers taking property from people without having to convict the property owner of a crime, that police agencies have stolen more money from people than actual overall non-police theft in this country.
Which is crazy.
So again, not to cast a shadow on all police officers, I would much rather have people in these systems who love the Constitution and understand kind of individual freedom and individual rights than anyone else, than other people in those roles. So, I know many constitutionalists who go in those roles because they do feel a deep sense of duty to do those roles
absolutely
correctly and appropriately. But certainly the incentive structure does not always lead to good outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah. So well said. Another thing that kind of relates to that, and I want to touch on this a little bit, and I want to get into some other topics related to Free State Project and its day-to-day happenings and where you see this going. You had brought up off camera the Defend the Guard legislation that you proposed, and this relates largely to what we're talking about when it comes to protection, and especially the dare I say, nefarious ways of the federal government to manipulate what was originally intended against itself and no longer do what was originally intended with state militias as an example. Yeah. So what is the Defend the Guard legislation? What's the purpose of it?
Yeah. So Defend the Guard is a state-based effort to fight the war machine. And I guess let me start by saying, maybe I'll share a little personal story first. When I was younger, before I was a libertarian, before I realized Ron Paul was right about everything and got pulled out of the matrix, I really watched a lot of Fox News. I really believed everything that Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity told me, particularly about the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq. And I remember being a high school student arguing with my liberal friends and being so adamant, and I kind of internalized all this war propaganda into my identity and my sense of self, and it was very hard for me to admit that I had been wrong about that. I think, like a lot of Americans who are on the right, I think it's taken people time to unwind and realize the lies we had been told, particularly because things were so emotionally charged after 9/11. We were attacked. Our leaders told us that it was because Britney Spears wouldn't wear a burqa. They hated us for our freedoms. And that was an easy explanation to hear and internalize because we weren't paying attention to what our government was doing halfway around the world, right? I think what like comic Dave Smith often says, like if you had asked an American in the 90s what the people in the Middle East thought of us, they would say, I don't know, that we're awesome. What could they possibly have against us, right? We didn't know what the government was doing in our name. We didn't know about, the 500,000 dead Iraqi children, like from the sanctions and starvation campaigns. We didn't know about the dictators our government was propping up as they oppressed their own people. We didn't know about the bombing campaigns. It was easy not to listen because it was like, it's easy to be kind of in our own bubble here and just trust kind of that the experts know what they're doing, right? They're the experts, right? So for me, that was hard to let go of. And once I finally like saw through it, it became the hardest thing for me to forgive what the neoconservatives did to our country, and what they did to, I think, the good people of this country, right? That they preyed upon our virtues, they preyed upon our patriotism, our love of country, our love of our Constitution, our love of freedom, and they used our virtues to get us to do great evil in the world. They turned some of the bravest, most like freedom-loving Americans who signed up for the military to go and fight for their country and fight for our Constitution, and they turned them into stormtroopers to go and invade countries that never attacked us, that whether it was Iraq or Syria or the starvation campaigns in Yemen. They've done great evil in our name, and they've gotten good people to sign up for it through lies and fear. And so that I can't forgive. And for the longest time, because Congress doesn't even vote on the wars anymore, right? Congress, they voted on the war in Iraq. They did an authorization for the use of military force, which is not a real congressional declaration of war, but there was at least something they went on record on. And then when the war in Iraq became so unpopular, people lost their reelections for it. I mean, Hillary Clinton lost the White House over it. She got defeated by a freshman U.S. senator from Illinois who nobody had known existed 4 years prior, right? Because of the war in Iraq. And so you would hope that that would mean that Congress would say, we have to be more cautious and careful about deploying our soldiers into these stupid wars. But instead, the lesson they took was, we have to do everything we can to never go on record ever again on these wars, while we let the war machine go on autopilot. And for the last 20 years, the anti-war movement has tried to get Congress to do their job, and they refuse to do it. They don't want to go on record, but they want to keep cashing checks from the military-industrial complex as they let the wars go on. And so Defend the Guard is a recognition that fixing this in Washington, D.C. is unlikely, but there are things we can pursue in the state capitals where we can make a difference. Now, in the U.S. Constitution, what we call the National Guard today, in the Constitution, it's called the militia, right? The state militias. And the federal government can call up the state militias for three purposes: to suppress insurrection, repel invasion, or enforce the laws of the Union. So you look at, say, the occupation of Syria that's taken place for the last decade, right? Barack Obama actually, as president, initially was going to go to Congress to get authorization, but the outroar from the American public about another regime change war was so huge that Congress wasn't willing to vote for it. And so the authorization never happened. And so they just put in our soldiers anyway. And we've been occupying this country for 10 years now. And was it to suppress an insurrection? Like literally the mission there was to foment an insurrection to try to overthrow the Assad government. Was it to repel an invasion? Well, we were the invasion, right? We weren't repelling it. Was it to enforce the law of the Union? I mean, there's no congressional declaration of war. And further, even if you were to point to like the 2001 AUMF about the war in Afghanistan, which they do to try to justify all of these things, right? that was in response to an attack on our country by Al-Qaeda. And we literally went into Syria and we allied with Al-Qaeda forces against the Assad government. And that's what led to the rise of ISIS. So there's no legal argument I can piece together for how this is authorized and our National Guardsmen are being used in this purpose. And it's important to understand that our National Guardsmen account for about 50% of the troops that have been on the ground in these wars of the last 2 decades. So if it's not to suppress an insurrection, repel an invasion, or enforce the law of a law of the Union, then that means the states have the absolute authority to call home their National Guardsmen from these wars. They could only be over there with the consent of the states. Therefore, if we withdraw our consent, then they come home.
Yeah, it's like it's based on tacit agreement essentially right now.
Yes. And so the New Hampshire House of Representatives became the very first lower chamber in the country to pass Defend the Guard legislation. We're having a little bit more difficulty in the Senate, but we are pushing forward on that.
What is the pushback that you receive in the Senate?
Well, it's the same pushback that...
is it like neocon pushback?
Yeah, I would argue, yes, it comes from a similar place. So, as the lead sponsor on Defend the Guard in the main Senate this past year and working it through the chambers over there, I think, it's the same argument wherever you go. First of all, I think it's interesting to note what is not the argument against Defend the Guard. The argument is not what it might have been 10 years ago, that our soldiers are embarked on this noble mission to protect democracy and defend freedom. And,
I think most people are totally over that nonsense.
Right. They don't even bother making that argument anymore, right? The argument is money.
Of course it is.
Right? The
military contractor money?
Right. The argument is if we say that the federal government is not authorized to take our National Guardsmen and send them off into undeclared wars that Congress doesn't care enough to sign their names to, then what if the Pentagon stops funding our National Guard, right? Which, frankly, I will say there's a lot of legal protections against defunding the state National Guards, so it wouldn't be so easy for them to do it as some argue, but even if it were, right? A good friend of mine who sadly passed away within the last year, his name was Sergeant Aaron Rollins. He was served in the Maine Army National Guard. He did 2 combat tours in Iraq, and he always told me this story. He got hit by a roadside bomb, and his buddy who was sitting in the seat in the vehicle where he normally would have been was killed in that roadside bomb. And I'm sure he struggled with a lot of survivor's guilt, like for the rest of his life with that. But I just remember being in the public hearing and hearing the Adjutant General of the Maine National Guard, argue about like, well, if we pass this, what implications might there be for federal funding, right? And I just remember getting out of that room and him turning to me. It's just, he's just said, I wish that he would look my buddy's mother in the face and tell her that it's okay that your son died because we got a few extra Humvees out of the deal, right? This should not be a question of money. It's a moral question, right? Whether our soldiers should be sent off into wars that nobody can even articulate the mission, right? I often think, wherever people are on like the abortion question, like I always think it's an interesting comparison, right? If you told someone who is adamantly pro-life that, for every baby that's aborted, the federal government is going to give our state $1 million. Is it okay now if we abort babies?
No,
right?
Absolutely not.
It's a moral question. It shouldn't be a question of money, right? I don't care how much money the federal government offers us to have our sons and daughters die in wars that are completely unjustified. It's morally inexcusable. And Defend the Guard is an effort for states to say, fine, Congress won't do their job. We will make you do your job. Literally, if we pass Defend the Guard around the country, all Congress has to do is vote on the wars. They want our National Guardsmen, they can vote on it. They can sign their names to it, and the electorate can hold them accountable for that, right? That's all we're asking them to do is
to do what it was originally intended to do.
Yeah. And one thing I do appreciate is, in some of the appointments that are coming from the Trump administration, I could quibble with people on certain things, but the new Secretary of Defense is on the record or at least the guy that Trump has appointed for Secretary of Defense. I guess he's got to get through the process. He's on the record supporting Defend the Guard. Tulsi Gabbard, who's going to presumably will be the new director of national intelligence, she's on the record supporting Defend the Guard. Bobby Kennedy's been on record supporting Defend the Guard. Now, I will say a lot of this is because they've been coming to our events in New Hampshire, where the libertarians are trying to get our votes. Tulsi Gabbard came out and supported Defend the Guard at the New Hampshire Liberty Forum this past year. And so, anyway, I think the fact that actually in New Hampshire we've kind of created a one-stop shop to come meet all the libertarians has given us a real ability to make our issues heard by the politicians.
Shilajit is one of the world's most popular superfoods. It's loaded with over 40 trace minerals, fulvic and humid acids, antioxidants, and more. It's a resin or tar-like substance that seeps out of the rocks of the Himalayas at extremely high altitudes, formed from centuries worth of decomposing plant matter and microbial activity, distilled by pure rainwater and pressurized by tons of mountainous rock. In a way, you could say it's kind of like the lifeblood of the earth itself, and we can use it to enhance our daily lives by absorbing its power into our body cells. However, if you've tried Shilajit in the past, you know it's true when I say it does not taste good, and that almost seems like an understatement. Some people say it's like licking an old used ashtray, and some people get a little more descriptive than that. Let your imagination run wild. It's pretty bad. But one thing is for certain. I've tried tons of Shilajit products, and no one has ever been able to cover the flavor, let alone make it taste good, until now. My friends at Organifi just released these new Shilajit gummies, and they actually taste good. They deliver 250 milligrams per serving of pure Himalayan Shilajit. Shilajit's benefits include supporting energy production, healthy hormone levels, performance and recovery, promoting collagen synthesis and heart health, increasing cellular energy, and decreasing fatigue. Shilajit has become super trendy in the superfoods and holistic health world for obvious reasons, and people have long been desperate for a solution to the flavor problem. That's why in the few months since Organifi released these, they've already sold out several times. Visit Organifi.com/TWF. That's Organifi.com/TWF, or just head to the show notes. Take a look at their whole collection, and when you go to check out, use promo code TWF. That code is going to give you a 20% discount on all of their products, and they have a lot of amazing products other than their Shilajit gummies. Find out how these superfoods can help you on your health journey today with Organifi. Yeah, and I think the deeper questions regarding, National Guard and the intent is are they being used for defense? Is it being used even in the context for state defense, as they originally tended to be? Because from my understanding and reading historical documents and understanding how this country was originally set up is that for all intents and purposes, each state was kind of like its own nation, and that's what it was intended to be.
That's exactly what it was. Right?
Exactly. Right? That were unionized for the mutual benefit of all the states in certain cases. Right.
And the United States government was supposed to be kind of like what the European Union is, right? It's a loose confederation, but the states retain their sovereignty.
Which is interesting, though, because the European Union is continuing to expand.
Exactly. They're trying to do the same thing that the U.S. government did over time, right? Is to siphon away the sovereignty of the states and in this case the European nations, and make them subordinate entities. Yeah. It's a shame because I really do believe my ideal would be that we had 50 different states and we were in a loose confederation and we could have free trade with each other, and maybe we could have mutual defense pacts. I think that's all well and good, but I mean, what's so frustrating is just that we established that, and the central power structure never stays in that framework. The purpose becomes to grow their power as much as possible, and that's what we always have to guard against.
So I know of some people in New Hampshire that I don't know if they're a part of the Free State Project, nor do I know that they live in New Hampshire for the Free State Project reasons and the reasons that were built off of that, the liberty-centric people focused there, that are coming from the premise, and I've explored this quite a bit, that the U.S. government is actually a federal corporation, sort of masquerading as a traditional government entity, and that we can fall back, whether we agree on that or not, we can fall back into our state citizenship and renounce our U.S. federalized citizenship. Do you know of anyone in New Hampshire that is doing this or advocating for this, or like at the least positioning like, hey, this federal system is becoming increasingly tyrannical. We need to really pull back into states' rights and focusing on the individual state?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with people using that as kind of a legal argument, or I mean, you could try to argue it in court. The question is, the federal court's going to recognize that, right? But I do think that the structure of our Constitution, even though we have so lost sight of the kind of the limitations on federal power and all this, I do think that the structure of the Constitution, there's still kind of a basic federalist hardware, as the software has changed, right, into a more nationalist and now globalist kind of software. The hardware is still a decentralized federal union. And so there are aspects to our Constitution that we can utilize if we have people in the state legislatures who are willing to exercise state power. So I believe very much in the 10th Amendment and nullification as a strategy, right? Rather than going to Washington, D.C. and begging them to change their policies, just through our state legislatures, let's pass laws and just say, we don't recognize your authority in this policy area. Article 1, Section 8 does not give you, to pick an example, does not give you the authority to prohibit a plant called cannabis, and we are going to do our own thing. And I think states have successfully nullified federal cannabis prohibition, right? Washington, D.C. never changed their policy, but the policy is in effect not in effect because so many states have opted out and said, we don't recognize your authority. The same can be done with gun rights. The same can be done with education freedom. The same can be done with so many policy areas. Defend the Guard is an example of nullification in action. So I think that nullification is the Achilles heel of the empire. If so many of these policies that come out of Washington, D.C., they rely on states participating in the enforcement of these policies. And if states do not cooperate in the enforcement cannot take place. Now, the hard thing is that the way the federal government gets states to comply, they have several carrots and sticks, right? But federal funding is it's the chain, right? They take our money and they ransom it back to us with strings attached, right? And so we find ourselves, and state legislatures are often very motivated to just do everything they can to maximize federal funds, even if it means giving up the freedoms of their people. Now, I will say New Hampshire has been, I think, uniquely historically resistant to this, even on something, just to pick an example. I know it's a small thing in the grand scheme of things, but like New Hampshire is the only state that does not have a mandatory seatbelt law for adults, right? Why does every other state have a mandatory seatbelt law? Well, because the federal government says you won't get your full federal highway funding unless you pass a law like this. Where does the federal government, what is it their business, right? What an adult wears a seatbelt or not? Like, frankly, I'm for wearing seatbelts. I think it's a good idea. I don't like doing it with a gun pointed to my head saying, if you do this or else we'll throw you in a cage, right? Well, they say, oh, we'll just give you a ticket. Well, what if I don't recognize your authority to give me that ticket and I refuse to pay? Eventually, you're going to try to throw me in a cage. If I don't recognize your authority to throw me in a cage, then there's going to be someone with a gun who kills me, right? So everything the government does is backed up with the barrel of a gun. And so when...
But what if you get a mass number of people in one area who are like, we don't recognize your authority?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the experiment we're doing in New Hampshire, right?
That's kind of what I'm getting
at a certain point, when enough people don't, when enough people say this emperor has no clothes, we don't recognize your authority, does someone still try to wield their imaginary authority, or what happens there?
Right.
So,
I mean, you can try. I mean, I look at it like, for example, I was in Oklahoma for the beginning part of the charade of 2020. And yeah, there was 2 weeks of people being cautious, which is understandable.
Yeah.
But the area that I was in Oklahoma, and even when I would venture into Oklahoma City, Yeah, sure. There would be signs on the door that say masks required upon entry. And some of the times you'd walk in and one of the managers of the store would say, "Hey, can you wear a mask?" And then you just say politely, "No, thank you. I don't do that." And they'd be like, "Okay." And the point is that
Yeah.
both there were enough people who are of the same mindset that this is all nonsense, and whether, again, they realize it or not, very libertarian oriented ideals that were just like, I'm not going to tell you what to do so long as you don't tell me what to do and try to impose it upon me. And that's how everyone was operating. And when you get enough people in that area, I mean, I never had run-ins with police officers in Oklahoma, but I would imagine that they're like, look, dude, we can't really do anything about this because the people don't recognize this.
And wasn't it amazing? I don't know if you had this experience, but I remember having this experience. Like, you go into a place, everyone's wearing a mask. Maybe you're the one person who isn't wearing a mask. And then other people's masks start coming off.
Yes.
Right? It's like people think that they're alone, right? And so they conform.
Yeah.
But when they see that other people are not going by that script, they feel empowered to opt out as well.
Yeah, and I think that's the mass effect that you're creating with the Free State Project. And so, correct me if I'm wrong on this then. Although the Free State Project does not expressly state that you are going, you are not expressly involved in political dealings, there is sort of an implied infiltration, if you will, and that's my words, of the state and the sort of local government and state governments, while also really advocating for liberty-centric ideas and getting liberty-centric people to come to New Hampshire in sort of like a twofold approach.
I think the way I would say it is, so first of all, the Free State Project is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. By the way, if anyone's interested, that means your donations are tax deductible at fsp.org. But as such, we cannot legally participate in direct legislative advocacy or in political campaigns. That's not our role. But our role is to get people from A to B. We want you to come from wherever you are, California or New York or Massachusetts or wherever you are, that you are being oppressed in one of the tyrannical 49 or the authoritarian 49, we call it in New Hampshire. We get you from there to come to join us in New Hampshire. And then you are free to go and build liberty however you want to build liberty. We don't centrally plan the Free State movement, right? The movement is its own thing. We're like the bus station, right? We help brand the state. We recruit folks. We help them kind of get settled and kind of integrated with the community. But then that's on them, right? And the great thing is, over the course of the last 20 years, people have built fantastic institutions that do a lot of these other things. So we have in New Hampshire a great organization called the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance. They're a 501c4, which does a lot more kind of direct kind of legislative advocacy, and it's volunteer run. Like those who want to get involved there, that's a great organization. People get involved to kind of affect the legislature. You have the Americans for Prosperity chapter there, which is basically run by libertarians, and they do a lot of the direct election work. So we kind of have many different organizations that serve many different roles as distinct legal entities. And the movement is bigger than any one of them. And of course, there are also many people who, getting involved politically isn't their thing. We certainly hope that they will vote for libertarian candidates when they run for office. But some people just want to go and they just want to build their homestead, right? They want to, they're building homeschool networks. There's
more anarchist, agorist type people.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. And I hope that they vote and that they support those who do kind of decide to more directly participate politically. But again, there's no one path to liberty.
Right.
You can come and build the kind of and advocate and build towards liberty in the way that you think best. I'm not going to bark at you with a bullhorn and tell you how to do it. But but if you want to come and get involved politically and run for office, and I've got 12 years of experience with that, I'm always happy to give advice.
Awesome. So I have some questions related to any sort of corruption, red tape, bureaucracy that you saw in government yourself as state senator, but I'm going to set that aside for a second. And I want to first talk about what life is like for people who are of this mindset, who are under the umbrella of the Free State Project And I think the first part to that question, though, is there one central location within New Hampshire that everyone is sort of moving to? Is there any towns? I've heard Grafton might be one of the locations that was attempted or is currently still being attempted to be like the town that a lot of people are moving to.
I think we generally think in terms of regions.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say that there's like one town or another that's like the Free State city or Free State town. Um, but there are, I think, kind of naturally, like, people oftentimes move to areas where there is a stronger kind of free stater presence. Manchester, which is the biggest city in New Hampshire, there's a lot of free staters there. In fact, a free stater just got elected, or a libertarian just got elected as the state senator of Manchester. Manchester, by the way, is really changing. I mean, it's the biggest city in New Hampshire, and it's electing libertarian Republicans. Which anyway, considering the Democratic gubernatorial candidate in New Hampshire was the mayor of Manchester, and then just running for governor, lost Manchester to the Republican candidate. There's a sea change happening, and it's kind of more evident every single election cycle. But Manchester is a great place. We have the first kind of Liberty Clubhouse called the Quill is right there in Manchester. It's a great hub of activity for community events, and but that became a model that many other have replicated in other areas of the state. We have different clubhouses. I live in the Seacoast area in the city of Dover. We have a clubhouse called the Shell. Actually, Robbie the Fire Bernstein was just doing stand-up comedy there. If you know him, Dave Smith's co-host on Part of the Problem. Mm-hmm. But there's different feels in different communities. We have in Keene, New Hampshire, there's a strong free stater presence, but I think that community is very distinct. They consider themselves, I think, much more kind of radical, anarchist, libertarians. They've done some really interesting activism over the years, including I remember they were protesting the local police department getting a Bearcat tank. Wow. They had a great slogan, "Thanks, but no tanks." But they also were doing for a while, they invented this practice called Robin Hooding, where they would go around, they would follow the meter maids. And
put in money.
Right. Anytime the meter maid was about to give someone a ticket, they come and just put a quarter in the in the thing to give them more time, and then leave a little note like, "You've been saved by a Robin Hood from the King John."
I love that.
But there's also I just took a tour of, we call the North Country in New Hampshire, which is beautiful region, much more rural, it's mountainous. In October, it's beautiful leaf season, but that's where I think that's where a lot more families and maybe more conservatarian, more conservative libertarians go to. There, if you're already married and have kids and you want a more rural lifestyle, there's a lot of homesteads up there. Cool. Great community. So whatever kind of you're looking for, there's a community for you in New Hampshire.
Wow, awesome. And I don't know if you have stats on this, because it'd be hard to differentiate between, these sort of freedom pockets in New Hampshire and the rest of New Hampshire itself in terms of crime rates and other statistics, other metrics that people would be interested in. Do you have anything on that?
Well, I would say that New Hampshire consistently ranks at the top or near the top on many different things. Believe New Hampshire was just ranked the #1 safest state in America, which used to be my home state of Maine until they started passing gun control in Maine.
This is my point too, because I was just in Australia a couple weeks ago, and at this event that I was speaking at, there's several people that I was having conversations with, and it's such a foreign concept to them to be able to have an AR-15 or something like this, or be able to open carry or even conceal carry. And I expressed to them that being in Texas, where there isn't many strict gun laws, that I actually feel safer knowing that, and I would say this is largely the same sentiments in New Hampshire and other places too, that, okay, I know that no idiot is going to try to rob me or any of my neighbors because we all have guns, or we could have guns. So because of that, there's sort of this mutual respect, and also I wouldn't want to mess with him. I wouldn't want to try to infringe upon him because he might have a way to defend himself. And Is that largely the sentiments you share in New Hampshire?
Yeah, an armed society is a polite society, right? And I think that the libertarian observation is a recognition that prohibition generally does not work. Whether it's you're prohibiting drugs or you're prohibiting guns, there will always be, under prohibition regimes, the opportunity for black markets and for organized crime to come in, to provide firearms and provide drugs that people want, because there's always going to be a demand for them. But the challenge is, right, particularly with gun prohibition, the only people you're effectively prohibiting from having guns are people with respect for the law, because nobody who's planning to rob a bank is going to say, boy, it's a shame I don't have the right paperwork for this gun. You know, they already don't have the right paperwork to rob a bank. I don't think we have paperwork for that. So government is great at providing us with the illusion of safety. And for a lot of people, that illusion is very comfortable, but that doesn't mean that you're actually safer.
Right. All right. So I want to go back to what I had meant to bring up a little bit ago, I touched on, was the sort of corruption, bureaucracy, red tape that you experience in the political sphere, being both a state senator in Maine, but then also having run for Congress as well. So can you share like any stories of some of that you were exposed to, especially when it comes to lobbying interests? That's what really...
Well, I would just say that I think the political system works, just not how they tell you that it works, right? So there's the conventional wisdom in terms of how you have an effect on the political system. As a legislator or a lobbyist or an activist, and that general conventional wisdom goes like this. Everything is relationship oriented. And so you want to make friends with the politicians and the decision makers and develop a good rapport with them so that they will hopefully vote the way that you want them to vote. You got to have positive relationships. And that works in certain circumstances, right? If you're trying to get like a little tweak here on a regulation that's things not generally controversial and there's no real like pushback against it, that kind of, we call that access-based lobbying, that can work. But if you're trying to get your freedoms back, there's usually a very entrenched interest group on the other side. And that is where it doesn't matter how good a friend you are to the politicians or how much they like you. And remember that politicians are professional, nice people. So they're usually nice. They're good at getting people to like them. They will still stab you in the back and not do what you want them to do because, I always go back to something that Morton Blackwell said, who was the founder of the organization called the Leadership Institute. And he said, we can try as we might and wait for the day that all of the right people who believe all of the right things are elected into majorities in Congress or the state legislature, and then they will do the right thing because in their heart of hearts, they know it's the right thing to do. Sounds pretty naive though, right? There's a self-selection problem. Usually the people who run for office are the people who love power because the people who love liberty run for the hills, right? That's our natural instinct. So rather than hoping that we get all the right people elected to do all the right things because they know it's right, we shape the political environment around the wrong people to make it politically expedient for them to do the right thing. So when I sponsored constitutional carry in the state of Maine and we got it passed, we became one of the first states in the country to pass constitutional carry, the only state to ever get it passed through a Democrat-controlled chamber to this day. It wasn't because I asked the politicians nicely. It was because I went to their voters and their constituents, and I organized and mobilized them to call, to email, to put pressure on their representatives and their senators to vote for constitutional carry, because otherwise they would face a very difficult reelection. And so you had many legislators who maybe they didn't think constitutional carry was a great idea, maybe they didn't trust people with their freedoms back, but they voted for it out of political self-preservation. And so that's where, when people, I think, get kind of black-pilled that, so-and-so is a terrible person And, you know, most, I mean, most people who get into positions of power are terrible people in some respect or another, right? But we have to look at how the system, how it actually operates. And so that's how we've been able to get constitutional carry around the country. That's how we've been able to get cannabis, laws changed around the country. It's putting pressure on the politicians and, playing on their need for self-preservation. So that's what I would say, kind of how we make a difference there. And of course, it works so much better even in New Hampshire because we have so many libertarian voters and people organizing in these districts and people actually getting elected because New Hampshire might be the only place where we have a huge concentration of people elected who are doing the right thing because in their heart of hearts, it's the right thing to do. That's the exception to the rule. But otherwise, but still, we got to also keep good people honest because the ring of power is tempting and it does corrupt even the best of us if we're not careful.
So Derek Bros and I talked about during our episode the nuance when it comes to state elections, state policies, local elections, local policies, right? And you can actually witness change happen in real time. I do question at the federal level whether our votes even count at this point. And I know a lot of people question the election integrity from the 2016, really the 2020 election, right? But I question all of them when it comes to elections going all the way back. And I guess what I'm getting at here is what I appreciate about what you do is that you're not telling people what to do or what not to do when it comes to federal stuff, but you are fully acknowledging that at the federal level, Washington has become totally corrupt to the core. And sure, engage in that if you want to, but what matters is here. And I sort of look at this even though it is within the political sphere, it's much more close to home and it directly involves people. And you can see change demonstrated at that level. So I still look at it as grassroots to its core because it involves people in that area engaging with things that pertain to their everyday lives, that they can affect change that then is demonstrated, whether, a certain thing like this thing that you sponsored in Maine is enacted, it affects their everyday lives and you can see it happen. Versus at the federal level, this sort of top-down approach, and that's been, sort of my criticisms with the Libertarian Party, I think it's futile. I think that, in my opinion, that thing is so corrupt to the core that it's wasted resources, it's wasted money, and it's wasted energy. And I could be proven wrong with what's happening right now. I totally could be, even with, RFK heading HHS. But even if I am proven wrong, I always come back to the power is in the people, especially when you get a group of people who are truly liberty-oriented and gather them together in one place, like with the Free State Project in New Hampshire, that what happens there, I won't say is totally inconsequential, but it is largely inconsequential because these people in this area are we don't recognize any of that nonsense anyway. And ultimately, if you try to say that we need to do this, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
We're literally just not going to do it. It doesn't matter what you say. And then how are you going to enforce it if there's enough of us who are just not doing it? You have no enforcement mechanism at that point. So that's kind of what I get at when it comes to that stuff. All this energy poured into that when it could be poured into things like the Free State Project.
Yeah. Well, and I will say, in defense of the Libertarian Party, I do think that they've recently been more effective than they have been at any point in their history in terms of using the leverage they have of this block of swing voters to extract concessions from the wrong people, right? Getting the wrong people to do the right thing because it's politically expedient. The fact that Donald Trump has promised to free Russ Ulbricht, who, is Donald Trump doing that because in his heart of heart, he knows it's the right thing to do? I don't know. It's kind of irrelevant, right?
Or floated the idea of removing income tax.
Yeah. All of these things. Right. I mean, I'm hesitate to believe he's going to follow through on that.
I don't think he is.
But I do think he will follow through on Ross Ulbricht, right? it's not going to cost him much political capital to sign a piece of paper and grant him his freedom, right? But that is an example of, right, shaping the political environment around the wrong people to make it politically expedient for them to do the right thing. The Libertarian Party, maybe they have 3% of the vote, right? But in a close election, that's the kingmaker vote, right? And Donald Trump recognized that. He came to the Libertarian Party, their convention, and said, here's some tangible policy things that you want. You want Ross Ulbricht freed. You want to abolish the Department of Education. You want, a libertarian in the cabinet. He made tangible promises that are measurable if he actually follows through on them or not. Whereas historically, the libertarians in the LP have just been kind of this siloed thing that everyone ignores because, I would say, play hard to get, not impossible to get. Like, have tangible things you want from them and tell them they can earn your vote if they do those tangible things. But don't give your soul to them, right? Don't forget that they're politicians at the end of the day.
Right, and don't give your agency and authority over to them, because there is a nuanced approach you can take where, like, look, dude, I don't trust you. You're a politician, but I only want to vote for you if I know that you are going to do all these things to dismantle the corruption, the tyranny, the bureaucracy, to bring back more freedom for us, while I also maintain the position that I'm exiting and building at the same time. And that's like the nuanced position that I'm like, I could totally see that perspective. But how many people actually take that perspective?
Right. But it is, of course, important to note, I think kind of what you were getting at there, even there, what libertarians are getting on the national level through this kind of transactional exchange is still wins on the margins.
Right.
Certainly, Ross Ulbricht kind of getting free is huge for Ross, for his mother, for their family. You could argue about ripple effect for the cryptocurrency community, the symbolism of one of these heroes being free. But it's still a marginal win compared to, like, in New Hampshire, we are almost like we've got a chamber of the legislature to vote to call the troops home from undeclared wars, right? We're winning much more tangible and essential liberties. Participate in federal politics as you wish, but ultimately recognize that it is a circus, it's a sideshow, it's used as a distraction for the most part. And the real revolution in this country will not be televised. It is happening in the state capitals. And I mean, New Hampshire's leading the way there, but I got to also acknowledge, like, when I got started, when I got elected to the state Senate in 2014, if you counted up like the Ron Paul style state legislators around the country, maybe there were a dozen or 2 dozen if you're being very generous. But thanks to organizations like Young Americans for Liberty, which is based here in Austin, Texas, where I worked for a year and a half, they've kind of taken this model of taking their young liberty activists and mobilizing them to go knock doors for liberty candidates for state legislatures around the country. They completely ignore the federal races. They focus on the state legislative candidates. And now, after this election cycle, like, we went from a decade ago, there were maybe 2 dozen. Now there's over 420 like Ron Paul style liberty legislators in state capitals around the country. Now about a quarter of them are in New Hampshire, so it's a little lopsided, but still, right. I mean, around the rest of the country, 300 plus is nothing to laugh at. And that's where what really is exciting to me about that is, right, you can do, right, it's not just kind of one state nullifying the federal government and being subject to kind of retaliation by the feds. But if we all start ignoring the federal government together, if we all start nullifying their unconstitutional laws, they could pick on one state, but they can't pick on all of us.
This is such an important point too, because this brings me to my next question. Obviously, as the director of the Free State Project, you want people to come out to New Hampshire. You want people to come experience what it's like to live amongst liberty-oriented people in mass. Of course, like, why wouldn't you? I guess, what is your position on those who are like, look, dude, I don't want to move to New Hampshire? Like, what is your message to those people?
I would say the Washington machine is not going to be defeated inside the imperial city. It's going to be defeated inside the state capitals. And if you think that in your state capital, you have fertile ground to make a difference there, look, I'd much rather you focus on, like, Boise than Washington, D.C. Like, go make your state the most freedom-loving, freedom-protecting state you possibly can. And certainly, I think that the work that I did in Maine was not in vain. I'm very proud of the work I did over the course of the last decade. I'm, just because it wasn't in New Hampshire doesn't mean it wasn't worthwhile. So yeah, go fight for freedom in your state. But if you find that your state is not fertile ground for freedom and liberty, if you live in New York State, which is literally on the Freedom in the 50 States Index, New Hampshire is ranked number 1 for freedom in America. New York is ranked number 50. The Free State is the freest state. The Empire State is living up to its name. It's like the worst state for freedom. If you find yourself in one of those states where you can't make a difference, no matter how hard you fight, the tyrants are going to win, then if you can, come and visit, see what's happening in New Hampshire. And if you possibly can, come and join us. We would love to have you. We're building a liberty homeland for everyone who yearns to breathe free. And we need more people. The more people who come, the more inevitable and sustaining this victory will be.
Beautiful. As a last question, where do you see the Free State Project and thus the state of New Hampshire? Where do you see it in 5 years?
Well, it's hard to predict the future, especially because we aren't centrally planning anything.
What's your ideal 5 years from now?
I think that I'd love to see, I think New Hampshire's on the verge of becoming the first right-to-work state in New England. I think you're going to see expanded school choice. I think you're going to see spending continue to be cut. I think that you're going to see further progress on Defend the Guard. I think that you're going to see the potential for Liberty U.S. senators coming out of New Hampshire over the course of the next 5 to 10 years as we continue growing our numbers and eventually defeat these entrenched incumbents who are there. I think just the quality of life is going to continue improving because I think that people prosper in conditions of freedom, and that's what we're achieving there in ways that we could only dream of in the past, right? School choice for decades was an idea that people talked about in think tanks, right? And it never got out of like a policy paper, right? It's becoming reality now in states like New Hampshire because we finally have one of the laboratories of innovation to put into place libertarian policy ideas and demonstrate to the world that they work. And then those models, when we demonstrate that they work, get adopted by other states who say, look how great it's happening in New Hampshire. That can happen for us. But you need that concentration strategy of folks who are willing to be the risk takers, the innovators, the ones who go first. And so I think New Hampshire is going to continue leading the way on freedom. And I hope that our numbers keep growing. And of course, our numbers keep growing, not just from people moving in, but like we've been there so long now, people are having families and kids. Like this is, we've entered the second generation of the Free State Project. This is, and I've always been a long-term, I'm always playing for the long game when it comes to the fight for freedom, right? It wasn't lost in a generation. It won't be gained back overnight, but the goal is liberty in our lifetime. And I think that we are on the cusp of it.
Beautiful, man. Beautiful. Yeah. And I love the multifaceted approach that the Free State Project or people who are liberty oriented, who are moving to that area are taking of both, the people who are living there are getting involved in local politics and helping to orient the local machines to be more liberty centric, and then also dissolving the illusion of authority themselves or somewhere of the spectrum in between. And that's like the nuanced position that I have come to, is understanding, like I said, that local elections might matter, and that state elections might matter, and you might be able to affect change. And that's not to say there isn't still red tape and bureaucracy there too, but we can do both. Like for me, I like to say I'm a principled voluntarist, and I cannot, for me personally, imagine wielding the machine of a government even against or towards what I want, but I could see where there's nuance and why people would want to, and I can see how it affects positive change in real life, and it's really making me reconsider that approach. Now, at the federal level, again, dude, nonsense, total nonsense. But at the state and local level, it really does matter to a large degree. And I think it has to be a multifaceted approach, though, of, okay, doing that, but also dissolving the illusion of authority and also doing my part to exit and build at the same time. And I think that New Hampshire is an incredible example of that. And man, with what you shared about how New Hampshire was, especially in these freedom pockets during COVID, it really just reinforces that idea that it doesn't matter what the machine does. It does not matter as long as you get liberty-oriented people in the same space who are of the same mindset, who are wanting to push forth freedom ideals. It doesn't matter what the machine does.
And I will tell people who are watching or listening, the number one thing I would ask you to do is go to our website, fsp.org, and you can click on our community calendar, and you will see for yourself that almost every single day in New Hampshire, there is some kind of liberty community event taking place, whether it's a libertarian hiking group or a cryptocurrency meetup or women getting together for a knitting club or there's something happening every single day. So people often think about our big events, Porcupine Freedom Festival and the New Hampshire Liberty Forum, which are great opportunities to come and visit New Hampshire. But you could literally show up in New Hampshire tomorrow and let us know, and there will be an event going on that we would plug you in, introduce you to the community, and you can see like what New Hampshire has to offer. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you and letting me speak with you and your audience. And I hope we will get you to maybe come and join us for Pork Fest.
I love that.
And the same goes for your audience.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Eric. This was amazing.
Pleasure's mine.